Hi, I'm David, and welcome back to COC. Today we're going to talk about major historical events every Christian should know. Church history is not just a story locked in dusty old books. It is a living drama that has shaped countries, empires, and the entire world. It's a history filled with courage and conviction, but also conflict and corruption. It's the story of martyrs who sang hymns as they went to their deaths, emperors who bowed before the cross, monks who preserved the faith through the Dark Ages, and reformers who risked everything for the truth. Church history is in a way a mirror. When we look into it, we see ourselves. We see how our faith has endured persecution, survived wars, weathered division, and in spite of all this, kept spreading to every corner of the globe. And each moment in that story, whether glorious or tragic, has something to teach us today. Also this video was really hard to make. We've had almost 2,000 years of church history, and I've tried to narrow it down to about 40 events, chronologically in order, that made all the difference. Needless to say, this has not been an easy task. But here goes. So what are some of the major historical events that you and I need to know? Well, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but here are some of the most important ones. Number one is persecution of the early Christians. In the first few centuries after the time of Jesus, Christians were a small, vulnerable community, predominantly in the Roman Empire. Largely because of this, Christians endured wave after wave of persecution. It first began under the Roman Emperor Nero, who falsely blamed Christians for starting the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. Christians were beheaded, burned at the stake, crucified, drowned, skinned alive, stoned to death, and fed to wild animals. Later Roman emperors, such as Decius and Diocletian, actually issued decrees demanding that Christians renounce their faith or face imprisonment and or death. What's interesting is that these early Christians didn't renounce their faith. In fact, many of them went to their deaths singing hymns and bearing witness that Jesus Christ is the Lord and Savior of the world. Next major event is the destruction of Jerusalem. In the year 70, another major event shook the world of the early Christians: the complete destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman army under General Titus. The temple in Jerusalem had been the center of Jewish life for centuries, and its destruction was a huge loss for Judaism. But, oddly enough, for Christianity, it actually helped accelerate its separation from Judaism and helped propel it outward. The Christian faith actually became less a local group tied to Jerusalem and more of a universal faith, destined to spread to the entire world. The next major event is that Armenia became the first Christian country. In the year 301, Armenia became the first country in the world to adopt Christianity as its official state religion. Under King Tiridates III, the entire kingdom embraced the faith, and Armenia became the first place where Christians were no longer a persecuted minority. Now the faith actually became the foundation for an entire country. The next major event is the Edict of Milan. In the year 313, everything changed for Christians in the Roman Empire. This year, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued a decree called the Edict of Milan. What was so important about this? The Edict of Milan legalized Christianity. Most of the persecution stopped, and the gospel started to spread more rapidly. What had once been hunted in the shadows was now welcome in the light of day. Christians could now worship openly and spread their faith without fear of death. The next major event was the Council of Nicaea. Emperor Constantine wasn't finished. 12 years later, in the year 325, he convened the very first ecumenical council of the entire church, called the Council of Nicaea. This was significant because the Council of Nicaea set a precedent for how the church would resolve future issues regarding various beliefs and practices of the faith. It also produced the Nicene Creed, the first major creed that outlined the basic tenets of the faith. The next major event was the Easter, or also known as the Festal or Paschal Letter of St. Athanasius. In the year 367, a saint named St. Athanasius was a bishop, and he wrote a letter to his church in Alexandria, Egypt. This letter outlined what books belonged in the New Testament. St. Athanasius was a very respected figure in the early church, and this letter helped future church councils finalize the canon of the Bible. Next major event was the Vulgate. Speaking of the Bible, around this same time, another saint named St. Jerome was commissioned by Pope St. Damasus I of the Catholic Church to translate the Bible into Latin. Before this, the scriptures were mainly available only in Greek or Hebrew. But St. Jerome and a few others translated the Bible into Latin, which made it more available to more people. The Vulgate became the official Bible for most Christians in the West for the next 1,000+ years. The next major event is that Pope Leo stops Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun was the ruler of an empire that stretched across Central and Eastern Europe. He was nicknamed the Scourge of God. And in the year 452, he and his army were getting ready to invade Rome. No army was strong enough to beat him, but Pope St. Leo I decided to take a chance and actually meet with him. Now, nobody knows exactly what was said when they met, but by the grace of God, Pope Leo actually convinced Attila the Hun not to attack. This was a monumentally important event because not only did it spare the city of Rome, it showed how the power and the authority of the church was growing. The next major event was the St. Benedict Rule. In the year 530, a monk named St. Benedict composed what has become known as the St. Benedict Rule. Among other things, the St. Benedict Rule admonished monks to emphasize things like prayer, humility, obedience, stability, and work, and it helped them preserve the Bible and help the poor. The St. Benedict Rule basically became the blueprint for monasteries across Europe for the next several hundred years. The next major event is Islam. In the year 610, a new religion emerged that came out of the land of Arabia, Islam. Islam was based on the teachings of a warlord named Muhammad, and it spread rapidly through the use of force. In fact, within just 100 years, Islam had conquered vast lands across the Middle East, North Africa, and even into Europe, as far as Spain. The rise of Islam profoundly reshaped the entire world and created a rivalry between Christians and Muslims that still exists today. The next major event is the Battle of Tours. Islam continued to advance into Europe until it was finally stopped in France at the Battle of Tours in the year 732. Now, this battle actually deserves a video all by itself, and one of these days I may do one, but I'll just hit the highlights for now. Despite being massively outnumbered, a Christian army under a man named Charles Martel, nicknamed the Hammer, was able to use a defensive formation and beat repeated Muslim charges, even eventually killing the leader of the Muslim army. A lot of historians and scholars today believe that the Battle of Tours helped keep Europe from becoming Muslim. The next major event is the donation of Pepin. In the mid-8th century, the city of Rome and surrounding areas were under constant threat from the Lombards. They were a Germanic people who had attacked and invaded numerous times. Consequently, the Catholic Church asked King Pepin the Short for help. King Pepin decided to donate a large portion of land in central Italy to the Catholic Church, which effectively created what were called the Papal States. The Papal States were essentially a new country that had the Pope as its ruler. The next major event is the crowning of Charlemagne. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned a man named Charlemagne as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The major reason that this was significant is because it began a relationship between church and state in Europe. The Pope had crowned an emperor and declared that heads of state ruled by the grace of God. The relationship between church and state had actually been growing for centuries, but this event kind of sealed the deal, and they became heavily intertwined from now on. Next major event were founding of universities. Christians played a crucial role in establishing the first universities, which originally grew out of cathedral schools and monasteries. Universities were originally created to educate clergy, but they soon expanded to include a wider range of subjects. The founding of universities was deeply tied to the Christian belief in reason as a gift from God, and the idea that studying the Bible, the natural world, and philosophy could lead to greater understanding of divine truth. The next major historical event is the Great Schism. In 1054, the third major schism in church history occurred when the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church excommunicated each other. Tensions had actually been brewing for several centuries, mainly because of cultural, linguistic, political, and theological differences, but they finally reached a fever pitch, and the two churches decided to part ways. Now, the good news is that several attempts have been made at reconciliation, one as recently as the 1960s. The bad news is that none of them have lasted for very long. The next major events are the Crusades. Muslims had been in control of Jerusalem and other Christian sites in the Holy Land for several hundred years by this time. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the Crusades to help the Orthodox Church in the East and to liberate the Holy Land from Muslims. The Crusades lasted for about the next 200 years and experienced some moderate successes. But they ultimately failed to liberate the Holy Land, and the area remained under Muslim control until the end of World War I. The next major historical event are the Inquisitions. While the Crusades were in full force, the Catholic Church also decided that it was a good time to start fighting various heresies that had emerged. Consequently, the Inquisitions began. A common misconception is that there was only one Inquisition. There were actually four major ones, and probably the most famous, or infamous, and most brutal one was the Spanish Inquisition. It became known for its harsh methods and persecution against not only Christians, but also Jews and Muslims. The next major historical event is the Hesychast Schism. Hesychasm is a Greek word that means silence or stillness, and it was a prayer technique used by monks in the Orthodox Church. It involved praying unceasingly, and a special breathing technique in order to achieve a direct knowledge of God. Critics argue that it was heretical because it said it was possible for a person to experience God's uncreated energies. Supporters argue that it was possible for a person to experience God's uncreated energies because he shares them with his created beings. In the end, the supporters won, and hesychasm became an accepted prayer technique in the Orthodox Church. The next major event is the Western Schism. This was a top-of-the-line mess. This is another event that deserves a video all by itself, and one of these days I may do one, but I'll just hit the highlights now. In short, we had three different men who were claiming to be the Pope at the same time. This schism went on for almost 40 years until it was finally resolved at the Council of Constance, and one Pope was finally elected, Pope Martin V. The next major historical event was the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery was a legal and a religious concept that actually came together over several years through a series of papal bulls that were issued by several popes. It basically justified European colonialism around the world. Among other things, it asserted the right of Christian Europeans to conquer non-Christian lands. The Doctrine of Discovery was actually in effect for around 600 years until it was finally repudiated by Pope Francis in 2023. The next major historical event is the fall of Constantinople. While Rome was the heart of Western Christianity, Constantinople was the heart of Eastern Christianity. That is, until 1453, when it was conquered by Muslims under the Ottoman Empire. The city fought bravely, but the Muslim army was stronger, especially because it had these huge cannons called basilicas. This defeat was a huge hit to the Orthodox Church because it was centered in Constantinople, and it also marked the fall of the Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for over 1,100 years, the longest running empire in world history. The next major event is the Gutenberg Bible. Around this same time, a printer named Johann Gutenberg created one of the most important inventions of the second millennium, the printing press. And in 1455, he printed the most important book of all time, the Bible. This was the first time in history that the Bible could be mass-produced and more people could read and study it. And it actually helped to lay the foundation for the next major historical event, the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was a huge historical event in which thousands of Catholics split from the Catholic Church and formed their own churches as part of a whole new branch of Christianity, Protestantism. The good news is that this caused several much-needed reforms in the Catholic Church. The bad news is that the Church is now more divided than ever, and we possibly have thousands of different denominations today. The next major event was the Radical Reformation. Believe it or not, there were actually a lot of Christians across Europe who felt that Protestants actually didn't go far enough. Hence, while Protestants call themselves reformers, these new detractors became known as radical reformers, or more commonly Anabaptists because they rejected infant baptism, and they moved even further away from the Catholic Church. This movement later produced several new denominations, including Amish and Mennonites. The next major historical event was the Act of Supremacy. This was another split, the fifth major one in church history. King Henry VIII of England wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she couldn't give him a son. Only daughters at this point, so he wanted a divorce. The problem was that he was Catholic, and the Pope wouldn't give him one. Well, King Henry just decided that he wouldn't listen to the Pope anymore. And in 1534, the British Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy created another new branch of Christianity, the Church of England, or Anglicanism, later called Episcopalianism in the United States, and it formally severed ties with the Catholic Church. The next major historical event is the Battle of Lepanto. This was another attempt by Muslims to invade Europe. Similar to the Battle of Tours we talked about earlier, this was a decisive victory by Christians against Muslims. Pope Pius V had created a military alliance called the Holy League to defend Europe from the Ottoman Empire. And in 1571, it went to war against a major Muslim naval force near Lepanto, a city off the coast of Greece. Now, there are lots of details to this story, including a miracle that happened there called the Miracle of Lepanto, but suffice it to say that this was another major battle that probably saved Europe from Islam. The next major historical event is the Gregorian calendar. The Western world had largely used the Julian calendar to keep track of time, but it was ultimately found to contain several errors, mainly because it was lunar and had some seasonal misalignments. Hence, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII had the Gregorian calendar invented, and today, 168 countries around the world use it. The next major historical event is the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was part of the wars of religion that erupted across Europe between Catholics and Protestants after the Reformation. Obviously, it was primarily religious, but it also had politics and power as other factors as well. Anyway, by the time it ended, millions of people had been killed and the continent was devastated. It forever changed the landscape of Europe, and many people started to see the value of possibly having a separation of church and state. The next major event is the Galileo Affair. In 1633, an astronomer named Galileo Galilei was put on trial by the Inquisition for heresy. What was his heresy? Based on his research, Galileo started to believe in a heliocentric model of the universe, in which the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. Galileo was found guilty, his books were banned, and he was put under house arrest. Now, to be honest, Galileo wasn't completely faultless, and even aggravated the situation a little. But the Catholic Church did eventually realize that he was right, and it later apologized. The next major event is the Coonan Cross Oath. During the Age of Exploration, colonizers from Portugal landed in India, and not only tried to colonize the natives, but tried to impose Roman Catholicism on them as well. What's interesting is that India already had a small Christian community that was nicknamed the St. Thomas Christians, because they traced their lineage all the way back to the apostle, St. Thomas. Legend has it that St. Thomas traveled to India after Jesus' resurrection and was martyred there for preaching the gospel. The St. Thomas Christians didn't exactly like the idea of being brought under the jurisdiction of the Pope, so they took an oath, now known as the Coonan Cross Oath, and vowed to never submit to Rome. The next major event is the Battle of Vienna. This was yet another attempt by Muslims to invade Europe. There were actually two major battles of Vienna. The first one was in 1529, but I'm only going to talk about this one because it was the biggest of the two. In 1683, a huge Muslim army launched a massive campaign to take over the city of Vienna, which would then pave the way for them to invade Central and Western Europe. However, a Christian king named John III Sobieski led a daring army to stop them. Now, there are lots of details of this story, including a miracle that happened there called the Miracle of Vienna, but suffice it to say that this was another major battle that probably saved Europe from Islam. The next major historical event are the Salem witch trials. In Massachusetts, which was a British colony at the time, a mass hysteria broke out where several people, mainly women, were accused of being witches. The whole story began when two young cousins, Abigail and Betty, came down with a mysterious illness, and their doctor thought that they had had a curse put on them. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft, 30 of them were found guilty, and 19 of them were executed by hanging. Thankful the hysteria eventually died down, but believe it or not, the last accused witch wasn't officially exonerated until 2022. The next major event is the Great Awakening. This was another event that happened in the British colonies in North America. In the 1730s and 40s, preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield launched a massive revival that called people to repentance and to have a personal relationship with Jesus. It was largely a reaction to the Enlightenment in Europe, and it led to a lot of cultural and social changes in the colonies, including giving birth to a whole new generation of preachers, many of whom were not formally ordained. It also helped pave the way for the next event. The United States of America is born. In 1776, all the British colonies in North America, 13 to be exact, decided to come together, throw off British rule, and form their own independent country, the United States of America. Oddly enough, the United States never established an official state religion. However, it was overwhelmingly Christian. And events like the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening years later helped ensure this for many years to come. The next major event is the French Revolution. A wave of discontent was sweeping over France at this time as commoners, hungry and oppressed, decided to finally rise up against the government and the church. The Catholic monarchy was overthrown, clergy members were arrested, churches were destroyed, and Christian references were removed from the calendar. The revolution gradually descended into anarchy and was ended by Napoleon, but the relationship between church and state in Europe was changed forever. The next major event is the Restoration Movement. In the 1800s, a lot of Christians had started to grow tired of the fighting between Catholics, Protestants, and other denominations, and felt that the church had lost its way. Hence, a new concept called Restorationism was born, in which adherents wanted to get back to the simplicity of the gospel and the original church Jesus had founded. Several new denominations and religious groups began, including Churches of Christ, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and Seventh-day Adventists. The next major event is the Communist Manifesto. In 1848, two prominent atheists named Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto, a pamphlet that outlined the basic tenets of a new economic and political ideology called communism. One of the tenets of communism is that it espouses atheism, and several countries, particularly China, the Soviet Union, and several countries in Eastern Europe, later adopted communism. Christians were persecuted, clergy members were arrested and or killed, and churches were destroyed. The next major event is On the Origin of Species. 11 years later, in 1859, another monumentally important book came out called On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species was written by a scientist named Charles Darwin, and in it, he outlined a new scientific theory called evolution. Evolution basically said that all life on Earth came about through gradual and natural processes. This seemingly put it at odds with the Bible, which clearly says that God is the creator of life. The next major event is ecumenism. In the 20th century, several denominations tried to come together and put aside their differences. Among other things, several interfaith dialogues and organizations were created, including the World Council of Churches and the World Evangelical Alliance, and several important documents were signed among the different branches, including the Catholic Orthodox Joint Declaration, Evangelicals and Catholics Together, and the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. A total reconciliation hasn't been achieved, but several steps have been made in the right direction. The next major event is the Scopes monkey trial. In 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, a high school teacher named John Scopes was arrested and tried for teaching evolution. Teaching evolution was against the law in Tennessee. This trial, called the Trial of the Century at the time, was highly publicized across the United States and around the world, and it drew attention to the potential friction between faith and science. Like I just mentioned, evolution basically said that all life on Earth came about through gradual and natural processes, while the Bible clearly says that God is the creator of life. Mr. Scopes was found guilty in order to pay a fine of $100, but the verdict was overturned a couple of years later. The next major event is the Jesus Movement. In the 1960s and 70s, a mass revival called the Jesus Movement broke out in California, primarily among young people. The Jesus Movement attempted to blend more traditional beliefs and practices with a more modern style. It laid the groundwork for more informal corporate or public worship services, and for what later became known as contemporary Christian music. The last major event I'm going to mention are scandals. Unfortunately, the latter part of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century have witnessed several major high-profile scandals in the church. In the 1980s and 90s, Christianity witnessed the rise of a powerful new force, televangelism. With the advent of cable TV, pastors could now broadcast their homilies or sermons not just to a single congregation, but to millions of households all around the world. This enabled the gospel to reach more people. But then came the scandals. Several high-profile pastors and or their ministries became embroiled in wrongdoing that involved money, power, and or sex. About the same time, another type of scandal also erupted within the church, and this one was far worse. Child abuse. It was revealed that for decades, clergy members had abused children, and their superiors had covered it up. Because of these various scandals, many Christians left the church altogether, some losing their faith in Christ completely. The good news is that these various scandals have led to many reforms. The bad news is that the damage to the church's credibility has been staggering. Okay, so there are 42 major historical events that every Christian should know. The history of the Christian faith is vast. It spans empires, revivals, scandals, triumphs, and wars, and yet through it all, the church has endured. Sometimes it has failed, sometimes it has flourished, but it has always been carried by the providence of God. By remembering this history, we see not only the mistakes to avoid, but also the enduring truth. The gospel of Jesus Christ continues to change lives and shape history. I hope you enjoyed this because that's all I've got for now. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Stay faithful, stay devoted, and stay convinced of Christianity.